The story of the United States and Venezuela does not begin with hostility. It begins with cooperation, long, strategic, and mutually beneficial. From the end of the Second World War until the late 1990s, Venezuela was not an adversary of the United States. It was one of its closest and most reliable partners in the Western Hemisphere. For more than 5 decades, the relationship was defined not by ideology, but by energy. In 1945, as the United States emerged from World War II as the world's dominant power, oil became the foundation of its global strategy. Venezuela mattered because it had what America needed, and lots of it. By the 1950s and 1960s, Venezuela was supplying a significant share of U.S. oil imports. By the 1970s, it was consistently among the top 3 foreign oil suppliers to the United States, sometimes accounting for 10 to 15% of total U.S. imported crude. This was not a hostile relationship. It was institutionalized cooperation. American oil companies such as Exxon and Chevron operated extensively inside Venezuela. Venezuelan crude flowed directly to U.S. refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast. In return, Venezuela received investment, political recognition, and diplomatic support. During the Cold War, while much of Latin America experienced military coups and authoritarian regimes, Venezuela was often presented by Washington as a model democracy. This alliance lasted for roughly 40 to 50 years, but it contained a structural weakness that would later destroy it. Venezuela's economy became overwhelmingly dependent on oil. By the late 20th century, over 90% of export earnings came from petroleum. The state relied on oil revenue to fund everything: welfare, infrastructure, political stability. When oil prices were high, the system appeared to work. When prices fell, the entire country felt the shock. The first major rupture came in the 1980s. Global oil prices collapsed. Venezuela entered a prolonged economic crisis. Debt rose, inflation surged, living standards declined sharply. In 1989, austerity measures backed by international financial institutions triggered massive riots in Caracas, an event remembered as the Caracazo, where hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed. This was a turning point. For millions of Venezuelans, the old political order, closely aligned with U.S. economic models, no longer looked legitimate. The promise of prosperity had failed. The idea that cooperation with the United States guaranteed stability began to collapse. It was in this environment that Hugo Chávez emerged. Chávez did not appear suddenly, and he did not invent discontent. He capitalized on it. In 1992, he led a failed military coup against the government. The coup collapsed, but his brief televised address made him nationally famous. When he ran for president in 1998, he won decisively. Chávez's election marked the end of the 40-year partnership. His worldview directly challenged the foundations of the U.S.-Venezuela relationship. He argued that Venezuela's oil wealth had enriched foreign corporations and domestic elites while leaving ordinary citizens behind. He pushed for state control over oil resources, increased royalties on foreign companies, and redirected oil revenue towards social programs. This was not just economic reform, it was ideological confrontation. From Washington's perspective, Chávez was destabilizing a key energy partner. From Caracas's perspective, the United States had benefited from Venezuela's resources while remaining indifferent to its inequality. The relationship deteriorated quickly. In 2002, tensions reached a critical moment when Chávez was briefly removed from power during a coup attempt. Although the United States denied direct involvement, it openly supported opposition forces, and the episode permanently destroyed trust. Chávez returned to power more radicalized than before. From that point onward, cooperation turned into confrontation. Venezuela remained an oil supplier to the United States, but the political relationship was effectively broken. Chávez aligned Venezuela with other governments hostile to U.S. influence. He framed the conflict as part of a broader struggle against American dominance in the global system. When Chávez died in 2013, many expected the conflict to ease. Instead, it deepened. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited a system that depended entirely on oil, just as global oil prices collapsed again in 2014. Venezuela's economy entered free fall. Inflation reached historic levels. Shortages became widespread. Millions left the country. At this stage, the United States changed tactics. Rather than relying primarily on diplomacy, Washington turned to economic sanctions. These measures were intended to isolate Venezuela financially, restrict its oil revenues, and pressure the government into political change. Sanctions intensified after 2017, targeting state oil company revenues and access to global markets. This is where the conflict entered a new phase. Sanctions were designed as an alternative to war, a way to coerce without invading, but in practice they produced mixed results. The Venezuelan economy collapsed further, but the government did not fall. Instead, power became more centralized. The leadership adapted. Oil exports continued through alternative channels. The population suffered the most. By this point, the conflict was no longer about democracy alone. It became a deeper question about power and legitimacy. Does international law apply equally to all nations? Who decides when economic pressure becomes collective punishment? When does justice cross into aggression? And who has the authority to enforce it? These questions are not abstract. They sit at the heart of the US-Venezuela confrontation. By the time the world reached the present moment, with legal actions, diplomatic breakdown, and escalating pressure, the conflict was the product of decades of structural decisions, not a single leader or event. The United States and Venezuela did not become enemies overnight. They became enemies because a long partnership built on oil collapsed under inequality, dependency, ideology, and power. And no side was willing or able to step back once the break occurred. By the mid-2010s, the conflict between the United States and Venezuela had moved into a decisive phase. The era of partnership was long over. The era of ideological rivalry had hardened. What followed was an experiment in modern coercion, one that would test the limits of economic power, international law, and global order. After the death of Hugo Chávez in 2013, Venezuela entered its most fragile period. Nicolás Maduro inherited not only political authority, but a system entirely dependent on oil revenue. When global oil prices collapsed in 2014, Venezuela lost more than half of its export income within a year. Because oil accounted for over 90% of Venezuela's foreign earnings, the impact was catastrophic. Inflation accelerated rapidly. By 2018, inflation had reached levels measured in hundreds of thousands of percent annually. Food shortages became widespread. Medical supplies vanished. Millions of Venezuelans left the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern Latin American history. From Washington's perspective, this collapse presented an opportunity. The United States had already accused Maduro's government of electoral manipulation and democratic backsliding. In 2017, it imposed sweeping financial sanctions, followed by direct sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company in 2000. The logic was explicit. Cut oil revenue, isolate the government, force political transition. This was not framed as warfare. It was framed as enforcement. American officials argued that sanctions were targeted, legal, and justified. Tools to pressure a government accused of corruption and human rights violations. Criminal indictments were announced. Rewards were offered. Venezuela's leadership was increasingly described not as political opponents, but as criminals. This marked a critical shift in the conflict. The United States was no longer just challenging legitimacy. It was asserting jurisdiction. From Caracas's perspective, this crossed a red line. Venezuela rejected U.S. authority to judge or prosecute its leadership. The conflict was no longer about policy disagreements or ideology. It was about sovereignty itself. And this is where the strategy began to fracture. Sanctions did immense damage to Venezuela's economy, but they did not achieve regime change. Instead, they reshaped incentives. The government tightened control over remaining resources. Political power consolidated. Opposition movements fragmented under pressure. Ordinary citizens bore the greatest cost. This outcome exposed a fundamental problem with sanctions-based strategy. Economic pain does not automatically translate into political collapse. As pressure intensified, Venezuela sought alternatives. It did not look to reconciliation, it looked to survival. Russia provided diplomatic protection and security cooperation. China extended credit, infrastructure investment, and long-term strategic backing. Iran shared expertise in evading sanctions, refining fuel, and maintaining state control under isolation. These relationships were not built on trust or ideology, but on shared resistance to U.S. dominance. The harder Washington pushed, the more Venezuela embedded itself in a parallel system. By the early 2020s, the conflict had become globalized. Venezuela was no longer a standalone case. It had become a test case, watched closely by other sanctioned or vulnerable states. Then global conditions changed. The war in Ukraine disrupted energy markets. Oil prices surged. Suddenly, Venezuela's reserves mattered again. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, the United States adjusted its posture. Limited licenses were granted. Selective engagement resumed. The language of regime change softened into the language of managed outcomes. This exposed another uncomfortable truth. Power is flexible. Principles are conditional. For years, Washington had argued that engagement with Venezuela was impossible without political reform. Yet when global energy security was threatened, those red lines blurred. This did not restore trust, it deepened skepticism. For Venezuela and its allies, this confirmed a long-held belief that international rules are applied selectively, shaped by power rather than consistency. This brings us to the present moment, a moment defined not by surprise, but by accumulation. Legal action, economic warfare, diplomatic isolation, and strategic restraint converged. Markets reacted. Governments responded. International institutions debated limits they were never designed to enforce decisively. And the central questions returned, sharper than ever. Does international law apply equally to all nations or primarily to weaker ones? Who decides when justice becomes intervention? Can sovereignty survive in a world where economic power replaces military invasion? And what happens when sanctioned states no longer seek reintegration, but realignment? The future of the U.S.-Venezuela conflict will not be decided by a single court case or political transition. It will be shaped by larger forces, the decline of unchallenged American dominance, the rise of alternative power centers, and the growing use of economic tools as weapons. Several paths remain possible. Venezuela may stabilize internally while remaining politically isolated. It may negotiate selectively without fully reintegrating. Or it may continue aligning with rival powers, further fragmenting global consensus. What is certain is this: the conflict has already changed the rules. It has shown that sanctions can devastate societies without delivering political outcomes. That legal authority without universal acceptance breeds resistance rather than compliance. And that power, when exercised without consensus, accelerates fragmentation rather than order. Not into resolution, but into reflection. Because the story of the United States and Venezuela is no longer just about two nations. It is about how the modern world handles power when agreement disappears, when enforcement replaces diplomacy, and when the idea of a single global referee no longer commands universal belief. That is why this conflict matters. Not because it is loud, but because it reveals what comes next. When people ask why the United States and Venezuela became enemies, the simplest answer is often the most misleading. This conflict did not begin with one leader, one election, or one policy decision. It began with a partnership built on oil, stability, and shared interests, and collapsed when that partnership could no longer survive inequality, dependency, and competing visions of power. For nearly half a century, Venezuela was a trusted supplier, a democratic ally, and a pillar of America's energy security. When that system failed to deliver prosperity to most Venezuelans, the political order that supported it collapsed as well. What followed was not chaos, but confrontation, driven by ideology, hardened by sanctions, and sustained by global power shifts. The United States believed pressure would force change. Venezuela believed resistance would preserve sovereignty. Both underestimated the cost. Sanctions weakened an economy but strengthened a narrative of siege. Legal action asserted authority but exposed the limits of consent. And as global power became more fragmented, the conflict outgrew its original boundaries. Today, this is no longer just a dispute between Washington and Caracas. It is a case study in how modern power works and where it fails. It asks whether justice can exist without legitimacy, whether sovereignty survives economic warfare, and whether rules can hold when those who enforce them are no longer universally accepted. The answer is still unfolding. But one thing is clear: the US-Venezuela conflict is not an exception. It is a warning, a preview of a world where dominance is contested, alliances are conditional, and power must negotiate with its limits. And in that world, understanding how enemies are made may matter more than choosing sides.